Hello, welcome to the Digital Classicist London Seminar 2024 on Friday 19th of July. We're here in London in Senate House, and we've also got an audience watching online. So for today's paper, we've got Dr. Naomi Scott, who's their A.G. Leventis Fellow in Ancient Greek Studies at the University of Bristol. She's just got a book out last October on jokes in Greek comedy, puns and poetics. Now she's working on Julius Pollux. So today she's going to talk about crowdsourcing a translation of Julius Pollux's Onomasticon, methods and problems.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. Just going to make sure I've got my PowerPoint. So, I should probably start off by saying that I'm very new to the world of digital classics. I don't have a background in digital projects, but I found myself here on the back of a more traditional project, writing a monograph on Julius Pollux's Onomasticon and on the role of the poetics of materiality in his reception of fragmentary plays in his reception of fragmentary classical literature. The work in progress I'm going to present today is very preliminary, and I'm indebted to my colleagues in the Research IT department at Bristol, particularly Serena Cooper, Mike Jones, and Kieran Pitts, whose collaboration and expertise has made the first kind of baby steps of this project possible. I'd also like to thank the Leventis Foundation, who funded my research on Pollux as a whole, and the Jean Golding Institute at Bristol, who funded a small exploratory project, laying some of the foundations for the possible crowdsourcing project on Pollux, which I'm going to discuss today. So my paper today will talk firstly about Pollux's Onomasticon, introducing this text and make an argument about why an accessible digital edition of the text would be of benefit to the scholarly community and beyond. And I'll briefly discuss how a digital approach to the Onomasticon fits into the current research landscape. I'll then discuss some of the difficulties in digitizing the text. I'll be focusing here on the complex relationship between the most recent critical edition and the manuscript edition, and what kind of ramifications this has, both practically and methodologically, for a digital version of the text. I'll then discuss methodologies of translation as they pertain to Pollux, and how such methodologies present both challenges and opportunities with regard to a crowdsourcing approach. Last of all, I'll offer some brief thoughts on the practicalities and ethics of crowdsourcing in the current academic climate, and on how some of the structural changes to academia in the last few decades, particularly in the UK, present challenges for a project of this kind. So the Onomasticon is an unwieldy text to work with, and one which is often cited, but very little actually read. Written in the 2nd century AD and dedicated to the Emperor Commodus, the Onomasticon is, as its name suggests, a book of words. Like many of his contemporary scholars and rhetoricians, Pollux was interested in the language of what was already to him the ancient classical world. Much of this scholarly discourse concerned what was correct, and particularly correct Attic classical Greek, and aimed to recreate the language of canonical authors such as Aristophanes, Euripides, and Demosthenes. However, unlike most of the lexicographical works of this period, including both the staunchly Atticist Pherecrates and the anonymous so-called anti-Atticist, the Onomasticon is not organized alphabetically, but by topic. The work, therefore, in many ways resembles an encyclopedia, as Pollux goes about cataloguing the ancient world, beginning with the gods in book 1 and going right down to the minutiae of the equipment in a bakery or the objects one might find on top of a table, both in the 10th and final book, via such chapters as on courtship for marriage in book 3, on diseases of dogs in book 5, and things that the ancients thought good to eat in book 6. The organization itself encodes a lot of information about the relationship between things. There is a specific epistemology to the catalogue as a form of information technology, and this issue has been only very little studied in the case of the Onomasticon. Pollux's work is used extensively by two categories of scholars. The first is, of course, ancient historians, especially those interested in the materiality of everyday life. Pollux's text is a phenomenally rich source of the stuff that passed through people's hands and made up their world in antiquity. In the last few weeks, for example, I've learned a lot about different kinds of fishing equipment in the ancient world. The Onomasticon is also a really interesting source on clothing and textiles, and its interest in the equipment and technology of manufacture, whether that's baking equipment or agricultural tools, also makes it a critical source for the study of labour in antiquity. The second group of scholars who engage routinely with the Onomasticon are those working with literary fragments. This was my own journey to the Onomasticon, so I've just written a book on Greek comedy with a real emphasis on fragmentary texts. And along with Athenaeus' Statement Sophistae, Pollux's text is one of our best sources of comic fragments. The Onomasticon is also a crucial source for the preservation of fragments of tragedy, rhetoric, and since Pollux was by no means an inflexible Atticist, even lyric poetry by authors such as Sappho and Anacreon. Almost any volume of fragments that you consult, you will find Pollux in there somewhere. And yet we don't really understand this text or his citation practices. There is a prevailing assumption that he is either a neutral conduit or that his citations are essentially scattergun. He just cites what he has, whatever he knows goes into his great heap of disorganized knowledge, and that's that. There is very little attempt to read his citations in the context of the wider work, largely because this task has been, let's be honest, just very difficult. The Onomasticon is 10 books long, it's around 120,000 words, and to date it has not been translated into any modern language, though there was a translation into Latin in the, I think, sort of mid-Renaissance. It's very difficult, therefore, to form any kind of big picture of what Pollux is doing. At best, you can look at context in a fairly localized way for each fragment, but the truth is that few actually manage to look beyond a line or so, or at most kind of a paragraph on either side. I think this is a real lost opportunity, since Pollux's discussions of the texts he's citing often encode information which is critical to understanding and interpreting difficult and highly fragmentary texts. So for example, recently reading a fragment of Sappho more carefully within its context in the Onomasticon has helped me to discern the meaning of a previously, I think, misunderstood and mistranslated textile term in the fragments of Sappho. Pollux really, really knows a lot about the manufacture of textiles. Both for historians and literature scholars, making this text more accessible via translation would be hugely valuable. Even for those already working with Pollux in some manner, a translation of the text would allow us to gain a more zoomed out perspective. The kind of work I've been doing in my own research, sort of reading literary citations carefully and critically in their wider context in Pollux, is frankly extremely labor intensive at the moment. At the moment, I'm looking at Pollux's reception of tragedy. This is a bit of a table on citations of Sophocles. I'm basically manually producing data whereby I try and contextualize each quotation within the Onomasticon to see, how he cites different authors, what topics he uses them for. So, for example, I found that he's got a really interesting habit of mining Aeschylean metaphor for unusual objects. And doing similar work with Sappho, which was slightly less laborious. There are only 9 citations as opposed to, I think, 74 of Sophocles. I found that Pollux cites Sappho primarily as an authority on textile production, which is quite a surprising reception of her poetry when set against the majority of the ancient reception tradition for Sappho. So this kind of labor-intensive work is worthwhile for me, since my interest is ultimately in Pollux himself. But for example, someone producing an edition of fragments is going to find that without a translation of this frankly not very readable text, they simply cannot read pages and pages and pages and pages to gain the fullest picture of how Pollux contextualizes any given fragment within his work or how he cites a given author. Similarly, an ancient historian using Pollux as evidence on ancient fishing technologies, to use one example, doesn't have a clear sense of the text beyond the chapter they're using. So they aren't able to understand how Pollux operates as a source. Beyond this, the Onomasticon also has huge potential for interdisciplinary reach. Its chapters contain information on everything from the history of technology and architecture to the global commodities trade in the pre-modern world. And without a translation, the text simply cannot be used by people in other disciplines who largely lack knowledge of Greek. There may also be potential for use, or dare I say the word impact, beyond the academy, since arts professionals looking to recreate the ancient world on stage, screen, or on the page would, I think, find Pollux to be an extremely valuable source on the everyday materiality of the classical world. The size of Pollux's work makes producing a traditional translation challenging, and I'll discuss some of the other challenges of translating this work later. However, digital approaches have been successfully applied to large-scale lexicographical works with similar characteristics to the Onomasticon. Most famously, at the turn of the century, the Suda Online project pioneered a crowdsourcing approach to translating the Suda, which, as its name, meaning bulwark, rampart, fortification, suggests, is considerably more vast than even Pollux's encyclopedia. So these are just some screenshots from what the Suda looks like. So this is the home page. You can gloriously look things up by topic, which is a really, really useful way of navigating the text. And this just shows you what a heading looks like. This one is on pillows, which is a topic that I will return to later. So you can see there, we've got there with the Bethe code Greek, which you can also put in Unicode, though for some reason on my computer, when I put it into Unicode, the head word disappears. But that just gives you a sense of what the Suda looks like. More recently, the Pura project, which is Purism in Antiquity, Theories of Language in Greek Atticist Lexica and Their Legacy, which is based at Kafoskere, has begun work to create an accessible digital open access resource, the Digital Encyclopedia of Atticism, which makes available in a single source an array of lexicographical Greek works, complete with user-friendly search functions, translations, and commentary. This is just a screen grab of the first entry in their lexicon. And there's a link there at the bottom where you can see the really extensive commentary that you get on each side, each entry. The work here is extremely extensive. There is a huge amount of contextual discussion for every single entry. In addition to these lexicographical projects, the Digital Athenaeus project, led by Monica Berti at the University of Leipzig, shows how digital editions can prioritize encoding citations. So this edition of Athenaeus allows users to search by author citation or by name, name of any named entity, and create visualizations of Athenaeus' citation practices, and can even map, I think, place names for you, which is, of course, a model to consider for a text such as the Onomasticon, which, like the Deipnos Sophistae, is also a key source, secondary source of fragments. Any digital crowdsourcing project targeting Pollux would, of course, need to begin with a digital version of the text. Now, as you would expect, there's a version of the Onomasticon on the TLG based on the most recent edition of the text, which was produced by Eric Bethe in the early 20th century. However, even if I'd been able to contact the TLG, which I kind of haven't, Bethe's text and the TLG's digital edition of it presents no few problems. The manuscript tradition of the Onomasticon is extremely complex. So as you can see here, this is Bethe's stemma. We've got 4 branches. The oldest manuscripts are M, which is the Ambrosianus, which Bethe dates to the late 10th or perhaps early 11th century, and C, which is in Heidelberg, which Bethe dated to the 12th century, but more recently, Bianconi in 2013 has pushed this back to the second half of the 10th century. The remaining manuscripts are mostly sort of 15th century. One is 14th, Laurentianus, and one 13th. Aldus Manutius, for his Editio Princeps, seems to have relied on a series of 15th century manuscript copies, which are represented by Xi in the stemma. The evidence suggests that all the branches descend from a copy held by Arethas, Bishop of Caesarea, who was bishop in, well, his dates are something like 860 to 939-ish AD. This copy was itself the product of an earlier epitomization, so an abridgment, and also, like most of Arethas's codices, heavily annotated by the bishop with scholia. And this tendency to annotate and even add to the text persisted throughout its transmission. Bethe's opinion is that there has essentially been a kind of porousness between the text and its marginalia. Add to this the poor quality of some of the manuscripts, so some at least contain only sections of the text because pages have been lost, others epitomized it further in the process of copying. The result is a highly unstable text. So Bethe, whose text you can see in the top left here, compared to Dindorf's below, makes the unusual decision to mark this instability throughout his text proper, rather than relegating it to the apparatus criticus. Where early editors from Manutius onwards were largely pretty inclusive in their efforts, so the text is a kind of compilation of absolutely everything that can be found in the manuscript, and the text becomes anything that any manuscript reasonably transmits, Bethe marks in square brackets that which is omitted in key manuscripts, so that we can see where all the manuscripts accord and where key sections of the text are missing from a given source. So you can hopefully see in the brackets there that we've got these square brackets and then we've got letters. So those letters obviously relate back to the stemma, and it tells you, you know, for example, philoi hetairoi is not in A, F, S, B, or C, and it brackets that off. As opposed to Dindorf's edition below, which, as you can see, just gives all these things as text proper without bracketing them in any way. So in some ways, digital editions are ideally suited to texts with this level of instability. Rather than reproducing a single text, as in a printed book, there is the option to layer texts and critical apparatuses so that the reader can decide for themselves what level of detail or what version of the text they want. You could reasonably create an edition where the reader ticks which manuscripts they want and can create a custom version of the text according to their needs. As Dahlström, 2009 says, digital scholarly editing, and I'm quoting here, offers the chance to organize paratexts and transmitted material in much more dynamic and complex manners than is possible within the printed edition. So an edition can become more like an archive of all possible materials. Studies by Pherecrates, Damon, and Keyline have argued that digital editions of classical texts can, and indeed must, embrace the radical instability of even the most canonical works, by both encoding and indeed expanding upon existing critical apparatuses, and embracing the possibility that digital editions offer to take what Pherecrates describes as a Heraclitan understanding of texts as inherently and perpetually mutable, as opposed to a Neoplatonist understanding that seeks impossibly to uncover the text in its original ideal form. A digital edition of Pollux would make it possible for the reader to decide what they want to view, and it would also facilitate just really easy engagement with Pollux's transmission history. Pollux's text certainly lends itself to this maximalism and embrace of instability. However, as Sutherland has noted, certain forms of reading and scholarship necessitate some form of stable text. The act of translation not only requires a stable text for translators to translate, but also adds a further layer of fixity of interpretation and meaning. This, alongside the aim of making Pollux's text more widely accessible to an audience not trained in the classical tradition of textual criticism, potentially strains against the uncertain quality of Pollux's text, and indeed of Bethe's edition, with its actually in some ways quite radical method of imprinting variants within the main text, rather than relegating it only to the apparatus criticus through these square brackets. From a practical rather than methodological perspective, Bethe's choice with these square brackets is proving to be an absolute nightmare. This is essentially a typographical system of Bethe's own devising, and the OCR software that we're using really just doesn't recognize them as characters. At the moment, the team at Bristol Research IT is grappling with essentially trying to teach the software to recognize and then either ignore or hopefully encode these signs properly, whereas at the moment it often tries to turn them into other more recognizable characters of Greek or English. So we're running it so that it is aware that there can be both Greek and English characters. So the English characters are obviously needed for the citations, which are there in rounded brackets. You can see one just at the very top in the text, A222. Whereas when it gets, and if it's got just one square bracket, it's quite happy to see that as a square bracket. But when it's got a square bracket with lots and lots and lots of letters, you can see sometimes it's just turning it into gibberish, basically. So particularly if you look 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines down, just at the very beginning of the line, you can see it's just really, really unhappy with whatever's going on there. Increasingly, my opinion is that any OCR mass-produced text is going to require a huge amount of manual editing and cleaning up. This is an issue aggravated by the brackets, but it would be true anyway to some degree. And the budgeting for this in terms of time and money will be necessary for future funding bids related to this project. Another of Bethe's editorial decisions is also proving problematic, and I think is going to require a much more complex solution. So unlike the Suda, you can see Adler's text of the Suda on the left here, the Onomasticon is considerably more complex in its organization. Alphabetical lexica present the reader and, of course, the potential translator with nice short chunks organized by word, which are nice and easy to approach. So you can see here in Adler, the head words at the beginning of each entry, they're all numbered. And then each entry is pretty short. The entry on Abel, son of Adam, here is a little bit longer. So some of the entries in the Suda are a bit longer than this, but on the whole, we are looking at just nice, discrete chunks of text. By comparison, Bethe's text is organized only by paragraph. You can see a paragraph break there in the text. Navigating by topic otherwise involves using the lengthy index, which is a volume all of its own. You look up a Greek word, you go to the relevant passage of text, passages. A potential translator does not have discrete chapters to work with. So both in terms of producing and using a translation, this lack of organizational structure is not ideal. The fact is, however, that the text didn't always look like this. With the exception of Bethe and Becker in the mid-19th century, every edition since the Editio Princeps by Aldus Manutius divides the text into named chapters. So here's Manutius's edition at Book 1, Chapter 40, which is the section of text I'm going to be using as my example for the next few slides. On the right, you can see a section of his table of contents, which, like a modern table of contents, is at the start of the book, and Manutius gives the titles in Latin to make consultation easier for the reader. So here at 1.40 in the text, you can see where the red arrows have just gone, the chapter title at the top there, Peri Basilicon Onomathon, on the names of kings. And we can see this is listed in Latin with a page number in the corresponding contents table. Nice and straightforward. If we compare this to Dindorf's edition, which is the second newest after Bethe, you can see the same chapter headings, same exact title, there they are. And again, he has a contents table, though he keeps his titles in Greek rather than translating them into Latin as Manutius did. This kind of paratextual apparatus is, I think, essential for navigating the text. I personally always sit there with Dindorf and Bethe open on my desk alongside one another. And it's even more essential for any kind of crowdsourcing translation endeavor. Now, Bethe removed the chapter titles since he considered that kind of paratextual apparatus was part of the marginalia which kind of infected Pollux's text, as Arethas's scholarly annotations were variously picked up and potentially even added to by copyists more concerned with the text's practical use as an encyclopedia than its purity. However, I think that this kind of hierarchy between text and paratext, especially in a work with such a complicated transmission history, is misguided. There's an implicit assumption here that we can kind of strip the text back to what is most original, even if not fully original, rather than understanding that a text, any text, but this one most emphatically so, is ultimately the product of its reception and transmission history, to the point that the text and its reception are to some degree inextricable. Given the nature of my own interest using Pollux to think about how the ancient scholarly tradition is in fact constructed our own corpus of fragments, through their reception and transmission, how Pollux is kind of instrumental in creating our corpus, it's perhaps unsurprising that I'm inclined to reject a methodology which attempts to kind of parse what is original from what has been layered on top by the reception history of the text. However, the manuscripts also provide a solid evidentiary basis for reinstating the chapter titles. I've found evidence of them in manuscripts dating back to the late 10th century, and crucially in manuscripts which aren't derived from one another and represent different branches of the tradition. So here's the fun bit. I've got some manuscripts here. This is the Ambrosianus on the left, which is late 10th, early 11th century. And you can see the title there clearly in the margin. It's slightly abbreviated from what we see in Manutius. And on the right, you can see the title in the Heidelberg manuscript, which is probably, Parce Bethe, also late 10th century. The title there is Praise of Kings rather than Names of Kings, but it's a similarly good summary of the content of the chapter. And here we have the utterly egregious Falcobergianus. It's a really, really horrible manuscript. But you can just see at the bottom now, I've just pulled it out, so it's a bit more zoomed in. You can just about work out the word epinos there. Nearly. Maybe you'll take my word for it. It is there. It's a really, really horrible manuscript. It's absolutely vile to read. So just a brief look at the stemma. You can see that these are all in different branches. So we've just taken a look at M, F, and C. And I've also, though I won't show images because they're not super clear, because they're not good quality photographs, but I have found them. If you will take my word for it, I have also found chapter titles in A and B. So this suggests not only that the archetype had chapter titles, this much I don't think Bethe would disagree with, since he imagines an archetype which has a significant amount of paratextual annotation. But it also suggests that readers and copyists of Pollux consistently understood those chapter titles to be an integral part of the textual tradition. While there is some variation in the exact names of titles, indeed some variation in the quantity of titles, some texts have comparatively more, some fewer, scribes seem to understand this as a work which has discrete sections. In other words, probably from Arethas onwards, and perhaps even before, this text is being understood as a work that you consult, not necessarily that you read in a linear manner. Removing chapter titles turns it into a linear text, as Bethe does, therefore fundamentally changes the nature of this text in a way which is both practically unhelpful, but more importantly at odds with how our ancient readers understood this text from the earliest point at which we have evidence for it, and possibly before. I do think we should at least countenance the possibility that this structure originates at the point of the text's epitomization. I can't prove it, but I think it's something we should really, really consider. So on one level, this helps us in terms of a digital crowdsourcing project. The chapter titles make dividing the text up, finding sections you want to translate based on your topics of interest, possible. And I think the manuscript tradition presents a good case for putting them back in as, if not original as such, as original as anything else about this text. This will facilitate the project in two ways. It makes it easier for the eventual user to navigate, and also presents, reasonably short, discrete chunks of text for potential contributors to tackle. On the other hand, this presents a new problem in that we need to essentially create a new edition, a new digital version of the text, which maintains some of the elements of Bethe, so the text, the citations, which tell us who Pollux is citing and what he's citing. I think hopefully also those brackets, so we get a sense of the manuscript tradition, but also putting in these chapter titles that he removed. So, while there are some digitizations of the text, including, of course, the TLG, which I did mention earlier, and also one produced by Stilios Chronopoulos, who's been doing some really interesting digital work with Pollux via kind of distant reading methods. And he's working on a kind of more complete digital text that will facilitate that kind of data-led work on the Onomasticon. This project requires its own digital text and a version of the text to suit its own specific ends. It's not, in other words, just about having a digitalization of the text, but a case of thinking about what kind of digitization is necessitated by different digital approaches. Just as there is not and cannot be a single stable text of Pollux that exists outside the editorial interventions of a given edition, similarly, there cannot be a single stable digital version of the text, only different modes of digitization based on the requirements and mediations of different digital projects. There are technological challenges here, of course, and the next stage of my project will involve investigating how much we could automate the process of putting the chapter titles back in. So potentially looking at creating OCR digitizations of both Bethe and Dibdorf, and then finding a way to map them onto one another so that we get a kind of mishmash of both editions. Though, as with the production of OCR text to begin with, I think the project will need to budget for a fair amount of manual human intervention. So once there is a digital edition of the text that is geared towards a crowdsourced translation and ultimately towards large-scale non-specialist readership, or rather I would say readership with different kinds of specialist knowledge than just philologists, the project will need to consider some of the methodologies of crowdsourced translation itself. Again, the Pseudo project provides a model for this. However, again, the Onomasticon is quite a different sort of text, which combines its lexicographical content with at times a more discursive quality. It can at times feel, if I'm honest, a little bit stream of consciousness, Pollux's text. So to illustrate what we're up against here, I've got an example from book 10. This is from a section discussing bedding, periton, tais clinais eponton, concerning those things that go on top of couches, is the title transmitted to us. And it's basically about pillows. Okay, I promised more pillows after my example from the Pseudo. So I'm just going to read out the English here, which is my translation, and it will give you a sense of the fact that this is not a desperately easy text to translate. So cushions, tulea, and pillows, knephala, are not only in the comedians, but also in the property confiscations. New pillows and old pillows are sold. And cushion, tulea, is in Eupolis, who uses this Ionic form in his Kolakes, but also in Sophocles, who says it in his Eocles, but also linen-sewn cushions. Hyperides, in defense of Micah, seems to name the makers of these, saying he hired cushion makers. In his Amphiaraus, Aristophanes has a pillow and a headrest of linen. Clearly, there are ones made of leather and wool, as also those ones sold in the confiscations of Alcibiades, there were leather and linen and wool ones. And in Antiphon's far on, according to the common usages, there is found cushions, tulas, beddings, couches, cushions. Just as also in Sappho, it is not a trifling thing to have observed that the nautical under the rower pillow is singularly in Crotinus' seasons. He does not consider calling it a headrest, but only a kind of under the rower rest. Okay, so this passage is essentially discussing three different terms for cushion. The dialectal variations in cushion terminology seem to have been something of a vexed topic amongst Atticist lexicographers and grammarians, who debated whether the apparently primarily Ionic word tuler could indeed or should be found in Attic prose, as opposed to the apparently more appropriate knephalon. However, unlike the staunchly Atticist Phrynicus, Pollux informs us that tuler is used in Attic authors, including Eupolis. Comedy is often considered to be, the Atticist language par excellence by these kinds of lexicographers. He's saying there it is, it's in Eupolis. Pollux also discusses the term proskephalion, which is literally a thing for your head, which is apparently why it's rejected by Crotinus when he describes a thing you sit on at the rower's bench. How can I call a thing that goes under your bum a thing that goes under your head? The issue when you're translating this is that LSJ will just tell you these things mean cushion. So a by-the-book translation is essentially going to go, and there are cushions and cushions and cushions, and Crotinus says cushion, but not cushion. It's not super helpful. And it doesn't really capture the kind of variations between different forms of vocabulary or the rationale which implicitly underpins the discussion. The compound words are in some ways a little easier to tackle. We all know how Greek loves a compound word. Really, we should translate this text into German. I've tried to get some of these across using hyphenated coinages. So quite often one of the ways I do, if I'm translating this text, tackle especially quite long words, is to pull them apart into their constituent bits. Issues of dialect are difficult to render without recourse to brackets, as I've done here, to make clear that he's discussing two different words. Distinctions of etymology likewise are complex. So tuler refers to something that is swollen. It's a poof. While knephalon is derived from knapto, meaning I card. So this is referring to the flocked carded wool that stuffs a pillow. So these are two different ways of thinking about pillow linguistically. It's quite nice. So crowdsourcing brings both problems and benefits for a text like this. To begin with the benefits. The diversity of knowledge required to understand Pollux's underlying rationale in the way he organizes and contrasts different words means that this is a text well suited to a large and diverse array of contributors. Crowdsourcing means that translators can tackle topics based on their expertise, especially if we do have chapter titles that tell you the topics. So, there are sections on plants and animals which require a high level of botanical or zoological knowledge, sections on clothing, which would benefit from someone who has expertise in textile production, sections on masks, which would best be tackled by someone who knows about theatre in antiquity, and so on. no one person can possibly have the breadth of expertise required to really understand what he's talking about in these very kind of technical passages. However, there are potential consistency issues, of course. This is a concern with any crowdsourced project, but the nature of Pollux's text, I think, in some ways amplifies the problem. The Onomasticon is both a linguistic and, I really think, a materialist catalogue. This is not just a lexicon, it's a book of stuff. And a translation which prioritises issues of dialect and etymology will be different from one which prioritises the technical material issues of what each object is and how it's made. This project will need to find ways of speaking to both concerns. I think some degree of commentary will be a necessity so that a reader or user has explanatory notes which explain some of the translation choices made by each individual translator, and which also offer further information on issues both dialectal and material, so that the resource is useful to the widest possible audience. As with the Suda Online, some degree of editorial control will also be essential, and I think a similar system where contributors, some are licensed to edit others' work, is, I think, a good model to follow. I don't see any reason to diverge from what the Suda did in that regard. There's also the potential to offer some optional training materials, which could at least raise some of the possible issues, draw participants' attention to the limitations of the dictionary when translating Pollux, and present them with options to consider when trying to solve these issues when you're translating a given passage. So, think about etymologies, think about dialect, think about compound words and pulling them apart, consider where offering transliterations is helpful as part of your translation, and so on. The final and kind of related issue that I'd like to briefly raise for a project such as this one is labour ownership and acknowledgement. The fact is that in the 25 odd years since the Suda Online project began, academia has changed fundamentally, and not, I would say, for the better. Precarity is far more widespread. Salaries in the UK, at least, are lower and workloads are higher, and the ref, combined with much lower job security, means the pressure for individual research productivity is very high. In that environment, I must be honest that I have mixed feelings about asking people to donate their labour to a project such as this, even if I think that the benefit for the academic community in the long run is considerable. There are, of course, ways of crediting labour, a system of accounts linked to individuals. Again, the Suda did lead the way on this. But the bald fact remains that translations on a crowdsourced project will never be refable. They're never going to be something you can submit as a publication in your tenure package. Your contribution might at most be a bullet point on your CV under service. It's the kind of thing, maybe if you have a more involved editorial role, it's a bit like being a journal sub-editor or something like that. There are, of course, bigger long-term rewards to helping to produce a translated Pollux. Anyone who wants to use this text, and especially to be able to use it quickly and easily, and to form a bigger picture of the text, will see a tangible benefit to their research and their publications in the end. But it's difficult to ask people to play the long game in a system that doesn't reward that. The Suda Online had over 200 contributors by the time it was finished in 2014, and I do broadly wonder whether a project like this today can reach those kinds of numbers of participants. In response to this, I'd be keen to think about the possible opportunities a digital project offers for a real and meaningful intersection between research and pedagogy. There would be a clear pedagogical reward for students in getting to practice their translation skills on an otherwise untranslated text. No cribbing the answer from Perseus. And they would learn a lot about dictionaries, their benefits, their limitations, how to navigate the information contained in something like the LSJ in a nuanced way. This would certainly be of great benefit to many of the students I've taught. Once a project were up and running, an annual summer school for advanced undergraduate and graduate students could be one way to get students involved under the guidance of academics. And they would also go away with the training to contribute further to the project after the end of the summer school. This is, I think, one way to drive participation in a way which is truly equitable, in offering immediate and tangible benefits to participants, while also creating a project which treats teaching and research production symbiotically right from the get-go, and uses its digital format to truly drive participation and create benefit beyond traditional scholarship. I would like to conclude by offering some thoughts on how a digital edition and translation of Pollux's Onomasticon intersects productively with the text's reception history. Traditional critical editions are in many ways, to a greater or lesser extent, concerned with originality and with producing a singular definitive edition of the text. can we reconstruct the text as it was first written, scraping away any layers which have been added on top of the authentic text? In other words, a text is situated in its reception history only so that the two can be prized apart. Bethe's edition has a complicated relationship with this approach. On the one hand, trying to remove the paratextual apparatus which structures the text in its manuscripts suggests a desire to remove that which is not deemed original, despite its complete ubiquity in the manuscript tradition. On the other hand, the use of brackets within the main text demonstrates visually to the reader that the text they are reading is the product of an intercession of a diversity of readers and copyists, and that they are not communing directly with Pollux himself, while at the same time suggesting a kind of hierarchy in that text, bracketing off anything which isn't in absolutely every manuscript as less secure, a potential kind of pollution, a potential sort of migration of things which should be marginalia into the main text in, this individual manuscript or this group of manuscripts. By contrast, a digital edition which prioritizes utility and accessibility over originality can situate itself productively within the reception tradition of this text and mirror the reading practices which the manuscript tradition gestures at. Apparently from Arethas onwards, readers and writers of Pollux's text approached it in a manner more pragmatic than reverent. At times, scholars are fairly Catholic, embracing everything the tradition might hand down and being willing to add to it themselves in whatever way they think might be useful, whereas others see utility best served by abridgment and epitomization. By the time we get to Aldus Manutius's Editio Princeps, we see an editorial practice which is both willing to include the widest range of text offered by the manuscripts and also absolutely intent on providing the reader with a text which is navigable and consultable with the greatest of ease. So remember those Latin chapter titles, which Latin chapter titles aren't particularly any more helpful to me than Greek, but in the Renaissance, their understanding is that you're pretty fluent in Latin. A digital edition which sets out to translate, edit, and annotate the text with a view to its accessibility and utility can set itself actively within this tradition, adding on top of the text handed down by the manuscripts, new layers, translations, notes, data tags that will help a new generation of online readers get the most use from this text. Rather than seeing the editorial interventions required to facilitate this as a form of compromise, we can see ourselves as the latest in a lineage of readers who have shaped Pollux's text to suit their own epistemological ends and intervened to create a text which, even more than most, is as much a product of its reception and transmission history as it ever is of Pollux himself. This is, I think, a fitting end for a text which, as my own work on Pollux shows, has in turn been instrumental in shaping and indeed creating our own classical corpus through its reception and transmission of the fragments of canonical 5th century authors. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Naomi, for a really brilliant paper. I think you've made a really fantastic case for why you should take a digital approach to editing Julius Pollux, to be more productive, more sort of flexible with the way that you approach the text. And it's really interesting as well how this fits into a history of innovation with the editions of this particular text. So to our online audience, if you do have any questions, please do feel free to type them in the chat. And we've also got an audience here in the room with us, who I'm going to open the floor to questions from now. So questions in the room. Okay, if there are no questions from the audience here, then perhaps I'll start off with one. So I was interested in the idea of the difficult vocabulary that's in there, that, if you look up all of those words in the LSJ, all you're going to get is cushion, cushion, cushion over again. So presumably one of the things that you'd want to do with a digital edition of this text is lemmatization, being able to, track different words or different related words as well through the text. So how do you imagine the sort of visualization of the lexicon, of how do you imagine the lemmatization working when you have such a tricky set of vocabulary, including presumably quite a bit that's unique or almost unique to the Onomasticon?
Yeah, so I think it's really essential that you should be able to search the whole text by lemma, and also by English, by English word. I think, and making sure that the translation is fully searchable is going to be really important. The honest truth is, I don't know. I think that to some degree, in terms of word, if you're interested in it by Greek word, you can kind of already use the index. There is an index of Greek words, and you can use that to navigate the text. But what I think would be more useful even than that, because like I said, we kind of have that already, and that's a specialist skill that, if you have Greek, you can kind of do that, is to tag by topic. So that if you're interested in bedding, it will tell you where else you can find things on bedding, on textiles, on wool, on any kind of related topic. So I think the thing for me would be that this project needs to ask translators to do a variety of things. One is to translate. The other is to write notes that explain the translation, explain, to say, hey, the word for cushions was a really vexed topic among staticist lexicographers. That's why he's really weird about words for cushions. And then also to tag the text by topic, to say, what are the kind of micro topics here and what are the macro topics? So, to be able to, if you're interested in labor in antiquity, for it to bring up all those passages. If you're interested in gender, to bring up anything that might relate to gender. If you're interested in tragedy, to bring up every tragic citation. So I think even more than lemmatization, which to some degree is kind of already provided by the index, it's to think about what the topic is in that wider way, and what kind of issues he's dealing with in any given passage, so that you can kind of compare passages, which is just currently just impossible. I mean, you can do it a little bit in that you can go by Dindorf's table of contents. So, I do sit there going, what kind of topics is he talking about here, there, and everywhere? But it's incredibly labor intensive. And then, of course, once you find the passages, then you have to translate them, and translating them is not, this is not a super readable text. I'm a Pollux super fan. I think this text is fabulous. But it's not very readable. I actually got locked out of the TLG because they thought I was a bot, because I clicked on, because I look up every word, because it's, even if I think I know what that word means, I want to know who else uses it, how common is this word. I go there and I click on every single word in the TLG, and I eventually, after about 40 times of asking me if I'm a robot, it just locks me out. I had to write to them, like really and truly. So this is. And I did work on old comedy. My tolerance for wide vocabulary is quite high. Weird words. I'm used to weird words, but this is something else. It's not readable. To just produce a translation of a small chunk. And so if you're interested in a topic or a word, to try and read that across the text without a translation is, really, really difficult.
Yeah, for sure. A question over here.
I think your idea of a database is the way to go. I've had some experience with database creation and found that my pie in the sky hopes and dreams really slowed me down. So if you have a form for each word that has 25 fields on it, which ones do you think need to be done right away, the first pass through, and which ones can be followed up on?
So I think for me, in terms of kind of tagging the text by topic and making it navigable in that way, what I would want to do is present a list of topics to begin with, to have much like the Suda has this very nice list of topics, which are the kind of the biggies that I think are the kind of big topics in this text. Textiles is definitely going to be one of them. Clothing, agriculture, really big scale topics, and to make sure that that's the first go.
And that will allow people to find it if they're looking up by topic.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you think those people are going to use this to look for a particular topic?
I think there'll be two kinds of users. One is to use it by topic, and one is to use it by author cited. So I think I would like it to be searchable by both initially. I mean, you can search the existing TLG text by name of author. That's what I do. You know, if I want all the citations of Aeschylus, I stick Aeschylus in and I search for the lemma, and it pulls them all up for me.
But you're looking for a thematic index.
I would like a thematic index so that it can be, because I think that's in the spirit of this text. Mm-hmm. And I think that gives it use to people who are not me. Like, I just want to know what he says about Aeschylus. I want to know where he cites Aeschylus, and then I want to sit down and say, what are all these fragments? Where are they from? What's he doing with Aeschylus? But I have loads of ancient historian friends who use this text, and they want to know all the stuff that mentions slavery. That, especially this kind of material culture stuff. Right, I've been working on the Sappho fragments, and I've become this weird expert in ancient textiles. I've learned vast amounts about ancient textiles by just reading Sappho in this text and reading all the different things he says about textiles. I'm thinking, my God, there's a huge number of people out there working on textiles who currently are not using this text necessarily, or if they are, they're using it in very localized ways.
And I will say that weaving is the #1 metaphor,
right,
in Greek literature.
Yeah, and it's so interesting, of course, that when Pollux, it's fascinating, because what he does with Sappho is he completely demetaphorises, and he does that generally. So it was super interesting to me that weaving as a metaphor in Sappho, I totally buy that Sappho uses that as a metaphor. She must have either. I think there are some examples. But Pollux isn't interested in that. He thinks that she's got absolute, poetic authority on the business of making textiles, because she's a woman, right? Right? So she has material expertise in textile production. In the same way, he'll do the same to Aeschylus. He'll take these Aeschylean metaphors and he'll just mine them for stuff and completely takes the metaphorical content out. Mm-hmm. So he will say, and Aeschylus says an oyster catching net. And you think, does he? Why would Aeschylus talk about oyster nets? And you go in, and it's part of this extended metaphor in the Agamemnon. And when we do have the full fragment, you can see the way he's kind of stripped out the metaphorical quantities. And you can see that sometimes in how he deals with even just fragments. Aeschylus says mulberry. And you go in, and it's a metaphor. And so he's got a really interesting relationship with this text. And certainly textiles, of course, poetically, I suspect if I looked for how he uses textiles in other authors, I'd find a similar thing where they're textile metaphors, or sometimes metaphors or sometimes symbolic resonances are removed so that he just has this very materialist, here is some stuff, and it's in the poets. And it's such a fascinating relationship with ancient poetry. And yes, if you're interested in metaphors of weaving, I bet he'd bring up loads of stuff if you could just search for textiles in Pollux. If you could just find all the textile stuff, all the manufacture, really, really interesting stuff. And at the moment, it's not impossible, but it's spectacularly laborious.
Yeah, great. Was there another question in the room here? Yes.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. I think paratextuality is key here, right? And you talked about how hard this text is to grapple with, and you can kind of clearly see how chapter titles helps you somewhat. I'd like to ask about if there's any kind of grander structures in the text that you can see. So if I say, for example, the Epitome de Cesaribus, which is a text that gives short biographies of Roman emperors from Augustus to Theodosius, it changes in colour for every new emperor, and that changes the paratextuality.
Oh, interesting.
Text.
In
So
the manuscript.
In the early MS, the earliest MS. So then when you get to the tetrarchy, which in critical editions is counted as a single entry, in the MS tradition, every tetrarch gets a new red in colour, which then kind of changes how the text thinks of the tetrarchy. I think when we teach the tetrarchy, we kind of think it's a counted period. You can kind of group it all together.
But they're really parsing it apart.
As an emperor. So I mean, it seems to me that text so huge is going to need some sort of grander structure at work. I mean,
in terms of the actual way that the discussion is structured, there are definitely structures here. It's not random. there are kind of different books have different focuses. So book 1, he starts with the gods. It starts with the gods, and then we move from gods and we move through temples and sacrifices, and we kind of, there's a kind of grandiosity to that. Whereas book 10 is described as being on skeuē. Skeuē is just stuff, right? It also means theatrical props, which is very nice, but it means stuff. And so we've gone from the gods to stuff. And I think different books definitely have different focuses. So there are books which have a lot of focus. There's a book that's focused on the human body very much. There's a book that's focused on, there's one that has lots on trades. Book 7 is where you find most of the textile stuff, because there's a whole load on clothing in book 10. And then book 7, sorry. I think it's 7. Yeah. So there is, that's, I think, also one of the things that translation could really do is give us that sense of what those kind of underlying structures are about why does one topic follow from another, and how is he arranging information in that kind of way. And I think being able to read in a slightly more zoomed out way will help with that. In terms of actually thinking about how, I don't want to say Pollux's text, but the text, as we have it, what kind of rationales there are for moving between different topics. And one thing there is at the beginning of each book is a letter to Commodus, a brief dedication. In terms of the manuscripts, they're quite variable. Don't see anything. The colour is cool. I certainly haven't seen that. They're quite variable. Some of them, they really pick the chapter titles out, and they really, they centre them, and it's really clear. And it's very much like a very formalised form of paratext. Whereas others, like that Falkenbergianus, which is utterly illegible, it seems like quite an informal kind of paratextual annotation where you're just scribbling stuff down in the margins. Oh, the bit on kings is kind of vaguely here, rather than a heading within the text. So they're quite variable in how they structure and understand the text. What is consistent is that they do it. Some have more than others, some are more formal than others, but they are certainly seeing the text as having that structure, but no colours. That would be fun. Part of them, not all the manuscripts are of equal quality. Some of them are beautiful, and some of them are scribblings. So there's quite a lot, and the more beautiful ones tend also to have more formalised paratextual structure. What I don't believe I've seen, I'm still kind of in the process of getting my hands on manuscripts and all this kind of thing. What I have not yet seen is anything like a table of contents. And of course, we know that tables of contents are absolutely used in antiquity. Pliny has one. Aulus Gellius has a table of contents. The table of contents as paratextual technology exists. And I have absolutely not seen anything like a table of contents until we get to Aldus Manutius. Now, that doesn't mean it's not there, but I haven't, at this point, I have not found it. Some of these old manuscripts, they're not super well preserved. So the Ambrosianus is like bound with another text about God and the making of the world. It's some kind of Christian text. And actually just finding the beginning of where Pollux started was quite tricky, not least because Pollux also starts by talking about God. And so working out when we've stopped talking about one God and started talking about lots of gods was quite a lot of work to just find it, and it's not marked, and it's because, the beginning of the text has been lost, and, it's just been kind of smushed together with something else. And, so yeah, there are kind of variances in the structure of the manuscript. Pollux, I think, one of the things I really want to know is more about what his rationale is, because I think the way he moves from one topic to another suggests underlying patterns of thought that are really important, and getting at those is part of what I want to do. One thing I find, for example, when he talks about clothing, it's very rigidly gendered. We talk about men's clothing, we talk about women's clothing, and then we talk about things that are worn by both people. And sometimes, I think sometimes Sappho is used as a pivot between the two in quite interesting ways. If you want to talk about manly cloaks, you cite Homer. If you want to talk about girly fripperies, you cite comedy. And so there's kind of interesting underlying rationales within the text. And I think they are there. it's not just a big old heap of stuff. It's not. It feels like stream of consciousness, but it's not. And so getting at all that stuff, I think a translation would really help with. Yeah.
Absolutely. So we've got a comment and a question, I think, in the chat. So a comment from Nicole Hartman, noting that the Onomasticon also talks about godlessness. Here you can see the reference for her paper, Dimensions of Godlessness in the Roman Empire, and she says she very much enjoyed surfing the text back and forth for all the synonyms and counter references. So another very interesting topic for Pollux.
Whatever you can think of, he talks about it somewhere. Pretty much any topic. It really is such a monumental encyclopedia of antiquity. I didn't know atheism was in there. I'm going to go and look now and read your piece. But yeah, it really is testament to the fact that if you want to know about shoes or you want to know about atheism, he's just got everything.
We've also got a question from Charlotte Ruchet about categorization. So another interesting approach is examining categorization reflected in the chapter headings. Your topics may be superimpositions. What does the text look like next to, for example, Diocletian's price edict? Or how do its categories compare with that used for Moralia?
Yeah, so I think there's some overlap, some quite interesting overlap. The one I've been looking at is, what have I been looking at? Suddenly I'm having a blank moment. I'm not still showing my screen. I'm going to look at my notes to see what I've been looking at. Oh God, there we go. Complete brain blank. Stobaeus. So there's some quite interesting overlaps with Stobaeus in that which is also this kind of it's not a catalogue in the way that Pollux is, because what it is a inventory of quotations, but he also starts with the gods. So I think that is quite interesting. But then Stobaeus is more like something like Plutarch's Moralia in that it's got these quite moralistic leanings. I think that's the thing that to me seems, again, there's a lot of this stuff out there and not all of it's super accessible, but seems to be distinct about Pollux is this interest in materiality, that it's not primarily a text interested in virtue. It's not a philosophical text. It's not a straightforward, it is a lexical text, but it's not alphabetized like most lexical texts of this period were. But what it's very much not is a kind of moral teaching, which I think a lot of these compilatory, encyclopedic, whatever you want to call them, texts like the Moralia or these other texts. I don't know much about some of these late antique moralizing texts, but certainly Stobaeus, they tend to have that kind of structure, whereas the thing that I'm finding is really unique about Pollux is that material focus, that what he wants is stuff, and that's not really something I have found in any other text. I think, to me, in some ways, the closest analog for something like Pollux is Pliny or Aeschylus. So those scientific texts, which are also about understanding the world. I think Pollux's text is a really interesting foil for those, because Pollux is very much about the human-made world in many ways, not exclusively, but much of his focus is about the kind of human-made world, whereas Aeschylus or Pliny is about the natural world. And I think that those are the texts that it is most closely affiliated with, and not in some ways things like the Moralia or even the De Classifistae, which is a kind of explicitly philosophical, I don't want to say moral text, because that's not quite what the De Classifistae is, but it has that kind of philosophical learnedness. Whereas to me, Pollux is kind of the manufactured equivalent of something like Pliny or Aeschylus. So we've got kind of the world of nature, and Pollux's text in many ways is the world of man. And I have not been able to find anything else like that. So yeah, there are some things that are the same. I think you got to start with the gods. That's just that seems to be just very much where you got to start. But I think in lots of ways, Pollux, both in its organization and its focus, is quite unique. Yeah.
Yeah, and Charlotte says as well, one connection could be the reference to praise, useful stuff for composing speeches. So once again, about sort of the world of man rather than the natural world.
Yeah, which, I mean, of course, you know, he does have that dedication to Commodus at the start of each book. There is a sense that, you know, if you the reason that names for kings and praise of kings can be two chapter titles for the same thing, because they are the same thing. Like, let's be honest, usefully, you don't want to be saying bad things about kings. So we put these together. Like, whether it's names for kings or praise of kings, this is the same thing. Do not say bad things, but, you know, so it does have a rhetorical function. You know, it's not quite so explicit about that as someone like Pherecrates, who will say, use this word and don't use that word. But it does have that potential function. But yeah, that kind of materiality is, I think, really, of the materiality of the manufactured world is, I think, really unique to Pollux.
Absolutely. And there's another comment from Nicole. An open question remains the manuscript divergences and knowing which parts of word collections are genuine and which later transcribers consider missing and added them. We might never solve this issue. So do you think that, you know, by using a digital edition specifically rather than some sort of some new version of paper edition, even if it's something that's nothing like Bethe's, do you think it's, you know, we have to use a sort of a digital approach for this sort of like unsolvable issue to make sure that it, you know, the unsolvability of the manuscript problems remain visible?
I don't have any interest in solving them. That's the thing, is, to me, that's not my understanding of this text. I don't think they are soluble, and to an extent my interest is in the fact that they're not soluble. Like I say, because my interest is in thinking about how Pollux, through his transmission, constructs or is involved in constructing our catalogue of, our corpus of texts, and how encyclopedias in general are instrumental in constructing the classical world, which comes down to us, that I see the classical world and all the texts and all the everything, you know, classicalness as a construct which has reached us through antiquity, and that our corpus is a construct, that it's not a happenstance. You know, to me, that is the interest, is that Pollux's text is the product of its construction. Pollux, you know, to the point that, I mean, should we even be talking about it as Pollux's text? I mean, yes and no. But that also it is in turn implicated in the construction of other corpora. So to me, that parallel is productive rather than something I want to solve. And a digital text allows you to foreground that, again, I don't want to say problem, but complexity, rather than treating it as something that needs to be solved, because first of all, I think it is insoluble. You know, we're dogs chasing our tail at that point. But also because I think the problem is interesting in and of itself, and that it's an interesting parallel for how I see Pollux's role and the encyclopedia as a form, its role in constructing antiquity as it is passed down to us. So yeah,
absolutely great. We've got a question here in the room.
Yeah, no, I really like that answer. Because I think it's not only not solvable, but it's the wrong question, right? I mean, it's not something you should want to solve. I think, I mean, to me, what you're describing, this manuscript, which never becomes a stable manuscript and never was, is the concept of the multi-text, right? This is the Homer multi-text,
which is a great comparator.
The sort of paradox of the Homer multi-text is that is the text that people want to stabilize more than any other text. since
the 4th century, right, in Athens with Lycurgus, when they're trying to stabilize this text.
So this, and there's a lot of digital scholarship has gone into that whole question of how do we just edit each individual manuscript, or what other ways are there to align them to each other and things like this. And I was wondering if this concept of the multi-text is also in part a solution to the issue you have with translation consistency and of people having different concerns and different expertise. So you might have two different translations of the same passage, one by someone who's interested in grammar and dialect, and another who's really interested in materiality or some aspect of history. And actually there is no way to reconcile them, so you have both.
Yeah, I mean, given that I'm worried that I can't get enough people to do like one translation of the whole of 120,000 words, I'm not super. I'm concerned about the idea that we now produce 2 or 3 translations of every bit. But yes, I think, you know, there is no single, and I think that's where a commentary helps, is to say, you know, there are multiple options, you know, that one person can say, this is my translation, but here are all the other kinds of information that I didn't manage to encode in my translation, and, you know, here are the compromises I've made, and here are the other possible ways of thinking about this passage. So yes, and certainly, I mean, the Homer multitext is a wonderful example, because of course it really embraces the idea of Homer as a multitext, which of course again reinforces, you know, what is for me the entire raison d'etre of working on Pollux, which is to understand the extent to which all of classics is a construct of its reception, transmission, construction throughout history. That, you know, Pollux and all these encyclopedic authors are so interested in reconstructing a lost world, and then we're using it to reconstruct. So, you know, we've lost it twice over because we've lost Pollux, and we've got this complicated history with Pollux, and then he's using it to reconstruct a lost world. You know, it's this kind of archaeology of memory, that kind of very Freudian idea of how. You know, he talks about Rome being cities that are built one on top of the other, on top of the other, on top of the other. And to me, the concept of the classics, especially with that very loaded word that we give our discipline, its very loaded name, is also, you know, this kind of weird construction of memory, and reminding ourselves that, yeah, Homer, which is the most canonical text in antiquity and today, is still not stable, and that they don't have a stable text, and that it's a performed text, and that texts that are performed are not necessarily very stable, I think is a really, you know, important thing when we start to think about, you know, anything to do with originality in classics. Yeah.
Can I comment also on your concern about finding enough translators to get it? I mean, one thing is that there's allowing a multi-text to come into your translation is not the same as demanding that each piece be translated 5 times. But it does occur to me that so the Suda online, it was translated astonishingly quickly.
Yeah.
You mentioned the 200+ contributors. One of the reasons for that was that it was novel. No one had done this before for a classical text. The other reason for that, and that is something, as you say, that may not be as easily replicated. But the other reason for that was that a lot of people used it, they assigned to their students. You talked about having, you know, sort of student type summer schools, and I think one thing that might be even more effective than summer schools would be sort of teach the teacher type. Get a summer school for sort of 10 or 20 teachers who would each go out and get 10 or 20 students. But other texts, things like the Pherecrates translation and the Photios translation, which were both done at Duke University, they set up these projects so that they would have untranslated texts to give to students, and half a dozen different people got involved and got their students involved, and they were almost disappointed by how quickly they were translated. It's like, we've now got nothing else to give to our students. So it might be, I think you're right to be cautious about, you know, where you started talking about the sort of state of academia having sort of changed slightly, and unpaid labor and all this sort of thing. But you should also be prepared to be pleasantly surprised by how much people you know take this on, especially once you get people involved in using it in teaching. Yeah,
so I think, I mean, the hope is that there are enough researchers just using bits of Pollux and translating them in their own, you know, anyway. You know, I you know, I'm just talking to people in my own department, and I say, you know, I'm interested in Pollux, and someone says, oh, you know, have my bits of Pollux. Like, I've got bits of Pollux, like, you know, really and truly, you know. So that's just in a 15-person department. That I have a lot of friends who are super into this text. One of those boring people who are my friends are classicists, but I know a lot of people who are really into this text and who are using bits of it in their research. And for them, it would not be a huge amount of work to say, you know, have what I've got anyway. In terms of teaching, the reason I think I would be more inclined to aim for a summer school for probably mostly university students. I mean, people doing A-level as well, rather than training teachers. That, of course, was the first thing I thought, is I want to train teachers to use this with their students. And then I thought, teachers don't have time for novel anything. Their profession has changed for the worse even more than ours has. I have friends who are classics teachers, and, I say to them, hey, would you love to wouldn't you love to translate this random bit of Pollux's Onomasticon with your students? And they go, yeah, that sounds great, but no, I can't. I have to follow the curriculum. We can't do anything that's not on the A-level syllabus. They will be reading, the set author is Plutarch, and so we will do nothing but Plutarch, and we will do only Plutarch. And it was even like that when I was at school, which is, So I think the issue is with teachers. Yeah. I think, I'd love to get school students involved in this, but there's just not a lot of space for kids to do anything that's off curriculum.
It's quite a transcript.
No. I mean, which I think there are numbers around the world, but yeah, I'd like to use this for my undergraduates. That's the main thing, is that I spend so much time just thinking with them about dictionaries and about what dictionaries are.
But I think we could find a dozen other people tomorrow who would also like to use it with their own.
Yeah, and then that would be very much my hope. So yeah, some combination, and that would be the nice thing about a summer school, is that you could run both in parallel. You could run classes for teachers and classes for students. So I think it's got real pedagogic potential. We're always looking for texts that can't be cribbed. A colleague of mine once got some brilliant Christian tragedy and set it as an exam passage during COVID when they could look stuff, so went and found went brilliant untranslated text. So everyone does want them. The thing about this text is it doesn't have a lot of grammar to test you on. That's the only thing. Like, the grammar, the syntax is not particularly challenging. It's not gonna find you good stuff on indirect speech or anything like that. Its utility is different. It's a very different kind of utility in terms of teaching. It's a kind of pedagogic utility that says, let us think about what words mean, rather than your standard, I need something with 3 indirect statements, 1 purpose clause. So it's different in that way.
Yeah. Okay. So one final question then, to finish off from online. So Miguel Sanchez says, I've dealt with the struggle of using Pollux's work many times, so I value the intentions of this project. Is there a way to stay up to date with future developments, a website or a group chat? And thank you very much. So what's happening next with this project? What might happen?
Watch this space. So it's really early days. My fellowship is primarily, I am just working on Pollux in quite an old-fashioned way, in that I'm writing articles, and I will eventually be writing a book on materiality, the role of materiality in Pollux's use of classical literature. But I have this ticking along in the background. Once we have a prototype, there will be a website, and of course any launch would be publicized on the Classicist list, but I think we're quite a long way from that at the moment. I'm going to need to fundraise to really make this happen in a big way, and I've got quite limited funds at the moment. I have been given some money to do this, and it's one of those things where I got kind of $6,000, and I thought, oh yeah, I can do lots with $6,000, and I could not do anything with $6,000. It was really, this has part of this has been a learning experience about how complicated this project is going to be. But I promise that once there is stuff to share, it will be shared in all the usual avenues and mailing lists.
Great. Okay. Well, just to say then, thank you very much, Naomi, again, for a wonderful presentation. Next week's Digital Classicist seminar will be the last one of summer 2024. It'll be Valentina Iannace on matching fragments from the Tebtunis Temple Library deposit, preliminary work to develop an AI software with some examples of Greek documents. It will be both online on YouTube again and in person in Senate House for those of you in London. So thank you very much again, Naomi, for your wonderful paper.
Thank you.